and we're on chapter 6. It's called Zapping the Brain. Given our exploration thus far, it appears that there are a handful of brain regions that are consistently associated with spirit communication and psychic abilities. These include the right parietal lobe, the right frontal lobe, and the occipital lobe. I began to wonder what would happen if we artificially stimulate those areas. Could I use technology-based interventions to help wake them up? Could I use technology-based interventions to help wake them up? Was it possible to utilize neuromodulation techniques to speed up the psychic development process? Rather than reinventing the wheel, I considered previous attempts to explore something similar. One of the most consistent brain regions implicated by both psychic skills and spirit communication is the right parietal lobe. This region appears to play an important role in the ability to tap or tune into information beyond the self. When this part of the brain is behaving and doing its normal job, we have clear boundaries. We experience ourselves as separate individuals, contained in our bodies. We know where and who we are, and we see that as separate and independent from others and larger world. When we disrupt the functioning of this region through injury, meditation, or altered states, these self/other boundaries become weakened, and in that space, we are not isolated and independent. We are interconnected, allowing us to move beyond our small sense of self and connect with those around us, or even to something greater. Not surprisingly, many of the psychics and mediums examine show a clear pattern of shutting down or disrupting activity in this part of the brain when they are doing their psi thing. Sometimes this appears similar to seizure activity on the brain. Other times it looks like substantial increase of slow brainwave activity. Either way, this part of the brain is no longer engaged in its usual activity. The first study to explore brain stimulation in anomalous experience in 2002, Blank and colleagues used implanted electrodes in the brain of epileptic patient to examine the impact of electricity stimulating different parts of the brain. When they stimulated the angular gyrus, a specific area in the right parietal lobe, the patient reported experiences that seemed to mimic an out-of-body experience. When the researchers used lower intensity stimulation, the patient described feeling like she was sinking into the bed or falling from a height. When they turned up the intensity, the patient described a full-blown out-of-body experience. In her words, "I see myself laying in bed from above, but I only see my legs and lower trunk." The researchers repeated this process several more times, each time with similar results. In a related study, researchers used repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation is also TMS, uses an electromagnet coil placed just above the scalp to send magnetic pulses into specific regions of the brain. This technique has recently been used as a treatment for depression, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette syndrome, and various other movement disorders. The repetitive part of the name refers to the stimulation sent as a reoccurring pulse turning on and off at different rates. In general, faster rates. The repetitive part of the name refers to the stimulation sent as a reoccurring pulse turning on and off at different rates. In general, faster rates tend to be more stimulating, activating the brain region, while slower rates tend to be more quieting, shutting down the brain regions beneath it. This approach is easier to implement than the previously mentioned study, as you do not have to directly implant electrodes in the brain. In that way, the RTMS approach is considered non-invasive. In the second study, the researchers pulsed 1 Hz into the RPL and then presented the research subject with a series of images. Some were morphed images of themselves, and some were morphed images of friends and colleagues. The participants' job was to identify if the image they saw was them or someone else. These two case studies suggest that stimulating or disrupting the RPL with either an electric or magnetic pulse can lead to out-of-body experiences as well as an interruption of the ability to distinguish self from other. These results are promising and seem to be pointing us in the right direction, yet they don't necessarily suggest an increase in psychic or spirit communication skills. If we extend our imagination of the right parietal lobe to include the adjacent brain real estate, we find ourselves in an area called the TPJ. This area serves as the intersection of the temporal lobes and the parietal lobes, and is also frequently implicated in the anomalous experiences. In a paper titled "The Out-of-Body Experience: Disturbed Self-Processing at the Temporal Junction," authors reviewed 10 different published case studies of neurological patients experiencing an OBE, covering very good, babe. You did it. Covering a total of 34 patients. The vast majority of these cases involve the right hemisphere focused on either the temporal lobes or the TPJ. While the temporal lobes haven't been prominent in the case studies I have presented, they have been referenced several times. The work of Michael Persinger indicates that this area of the brain may also be an important target for some of our brain stimulation experiments. Michael Persinger and his colleague Stanley Coren spent decades exploring whether certain kinds of brain stimulation could be used to induce an OBE and experience non-corporeal entities or mystical states. This wasn't their original intention, but rather a happy accident. Initially, they thought they might be able to stimulate creativity or inspiration by disrupting the usual interconnectedness of the left and right hemispheres. Their idea was to apply a weak magnetic field onto the temporal lobes. As soon as they started this program of research, participants began reporting strange experiences, including the feeling of a presence, visions, or some other meaningful spiritual experience. With some of Persinger's protocols, up to 80% of the participants described something that might be considered paranormal. For this reason, their device soon became known as the God Helmet. While it was not the original intention, targeting the temporal lobes may be a useful approach. Other research has shown that people with temporal lobe epilepsy often report heightened spiritual experiences, including OBEs. These unexpected experiences shifted Persinger's research focus. Through experimentation, he found that there are several different stimulation approaches. That seem to be effective with somewhat different outcomes. Apparently, stimulating the right parietal lobe in a particular manner often led to feeling or sense of presence oriented towards their left side. Apparently, stimulating the right temporal lobe in a particular manner often led to the feeling or sense of presence oriented towards their left side. Doing a similar stimulation pattern on the left temporal lobe or on both temporal lobes also consistently led to the feeling of presence, but its location varied depending on the person. Sometimes it would be the right, sometimes to the left, and other times it was above or behind the person wearing the helmet.
What are you doing?
Persinger's approach had another advantage. Rather than using high-powered magnetic stimulation like a traditional TMS device, Persinger was using a lower-powered magnetic stimulation device. While exposure to high power has to be limited for risk of overheating the brain, low-power TMS carries a low risk
What are you
and can
doing?
be applied for longer periods of time.
Chat.
This makes it much safer and easier
Chat.
to use.
The last
Very
word's
good.
chat.
It is. Much safer and easier to use for psychic development.
Oh no!
As my work as a psychologist involves neuromodulation, I was familiar with low power TMS. In fact, I own several systems that have this capability and the flexibility to program them in targeted ways. Historically, I had used this tech to disrupt rigid patterns in the brain prior to neurofeedback. The idea was that it could be helpful to nudge the brain out of its stuck spots, following up with the neurofeedback to tell the brain what you want it to do, so to speak. I was excited to try this approach for psychic development, but wasn't quite sure how to start. Even though Persinger and others have published some information on their approach, they also kept some of the details of the protocol protected as a trade secret. As I began thinking about the best approach for zapping the brain, that one,
Oh, this one?
yeah, I consulted again.
What are you doing?
Watch out, baby. I consulted again with Dr. Diane Powell, a friend and psychiatrist who has been studying psychic phenomena for decades. In her book, The ESP Enigma, she explored some of the research discussed above and suggested that unusual activity in the angular gyrus and nearby areas appears to facilitate access to psychic information. She also suggests that the brain stimulation approach is most likely to lead to interesting results.
What are you doing?
I think I read that wrong. She also suggests that the brain stimulation approach most likely
Are you playing?
to lead to interesting results would involve both the right angular gyrus and the temporal lobe. I wondered about combining the two approaches, but wasn't sure whether to stimulate one temporal lobe or both. Even though the data from the angular gyrus clearly points to the right side, most of the research with the temporal lobes implicates the left side. For example, as reported in the ESP Enigma, Willoughby, Britain, found that 22% of people with a history of near-death experiences demonstrate seizure-like activity in the left temporal lobe. However, a study by Tedros and colleagues found that people with right hemisphere epilepsy report a higher frequency of spiritual experiences compared to those with left hemisphere epilepsy. Perhaps the right and left temporal lobes are involved in different aspects of altered states, or perhaps it depends on the person. Each time I try a new technique, I begin with myself. I decide to use a consumer-grade TMS device called the NeoRhythm, which looks like a heavy plastic headband. This device has 4 coils on it and is controlled through a Bluetooth connection to a smartphone or iPad. The design makes it easy to shift the positioning on the head to impact specific areas. I place the headband toward the back of my head with 2 coils on the parietal lobe, left and right, and 2 coils on the temporal lobes, left and right. I ran a 13-minute session with frequencies at 10 Hz and 4 Hz. Within a few minutes of beginning of the session, I started feeling uncomfortable in my body. I felt a bit lightheaded and noticed my meditation heading into a deeper state that is often accompanied by a spasm or a twitch in my left arm. Nothing particularly interesting happened during the meditation. It occurred to me afterward that perhaps I had the intensity too high on the device, causing the slight discomfort. I felt a little spacey after the session and went to bed. My sleep was more unsettled than usual. I had a dream about finding a large, beautiful feather, which it says I don't normally remember my dreams. I don't recall the specific circumstance in the dream sequence, but I do remember the feeling that this feather was significant and a sign. During my meditation the next morning, I felt different. I felt tapped in a way that has a distinct feeling for me. I don't know how to describe this feeling, but it comes with an awareness that I'm not more intuitively engaged. That I am more intuitively engaged. The morning after I felt attuned to the energy with my body and received a spontaneous understanding that raised my chin slightly during the meditation that could help me tune into higher energies. As I did this, I noticed that the tone of my meditation shifted, and I was aware of energy in and around my head and directed toward the center of my brain. I spontaneously began thinking of people in my life and seeing the color associated with them. My understanding was the color I was seeing was a frequency they needed for balance, like an individualized healing frequency based on whatever they were struggling with at the time. After my meditation, I felt drawn to pull a few tarot cards. This is not something I do on a regular basis. As I looked up the interpretation of the cards in my favorite tarot book, all three of them mentioned intuitive sensing. Are you okay, baby?
Yeah.
A repetitive state of being and listening to my inner teacher. Much of the morning meditation experience was atypical for me, and the only thing different was the TMS session the night before. This suggested that the effects of the session were delayed. Later the same morning, I went to my favorite coffee shop to see Julie Rost. She was the owner of the cafe and a psychic medium. She had been the first person that came to mind during my morning meditation. Knowing that she was open to this kind of conversation, I told her about my meditation and that I was seeing that she needed the color blue for balance or healing. As I said that, I looked at her and she had on blue pants and blue in her shirt. I commented on this and she affirmed that we often choose colors to wear that we need. She asked me if I had any sense about the meaning of blue. I told her that in my initial reaction was related to Chinese medicine and the 5 elements. Blue is associated with the kidney system and emotion of fear. As soon as I said this, Julie's face blushed. I hoped I hadn't said anything wrong. She told me that she had recently been waking up from sleep with fear response related to some work-related concerns. Despite my discomfort the night before, I started to think maybe I was onto something here, but that it needed a bit of fine-tuning. I wondered what might have happened if I did the same process focusing on the right cranial and temporal lobes, rather than both hemispheres. If I were to run the program at the slower frequency or adjust the power of it, would this prevent the discomfort? What might happen if I were trying this technique on someone with more developed psychic abilities? Having already received a psychic tarot reading with Julie, I had a good sense of her psychic abilities. I wanted to see what her reaction would be to using the TMS STEM technology and if it might add anything to her experience. We started with the baseline EEG just sitting there. Then I recorded another EEG while Julie tuned in. The direction of this session was left ambiguous and served as another baseline. What was it like when she tuned in an atypical way? She began with her eyes open and gave a play-by-play of her process. She indicated that she typically begins one of her sessions by tuning her chakras. She described beginning with her root chakra and moving up, scanning for any stale or toxic energy, and then using her directed attention/intention to spin the chakra until they are shining brightly. This process took about 2 minutes, after which she imagined pouring cold water through her crown chakra to rinse out the dust and debris, sending any excess energy into the earth for transmutation. She then reported stepping into a room to meet her guides. She indicated that she works with 13 spiritual helpers on the astral plane. Thank you. These guides provide direction and assistance in her work. Julie described interacting with a couple of the helpers, including the Tibetan monk and Archangel Raphael. At this point, Julie closed her eyes and reported the impression of a green healing light being used to help heal a friend's shoulders and spine. She noted that her hands felt warm during this type of healing and then become cold when the healing was complete. Julie then asked her guides if there were anything they wanted her to know. As she received the information from them, she stated out loud for my benefit, She reported hearing that inflammation can be treated through diet by examining the health of the gut. When we eat inflammatory foods, it is similar to re-traumatizing the body. We cannot heal our trauma until our gut health is proper alignment. She reported seeing red warbly lines that were some kind of sign in her mind's eye of inflammation. She indicated that this sign would help her in the future. If someone comes to her for guidance and she sees these lines, like heat coming off hot pavement, she will know that it is related to inflammation. At this point, I asked if this was a good time to shift gears. Julie indicated that this was not a problem for her. She can step out of this psychic space and then easily step back in. In preparation for the next recording, I added the TMS coils. For this experiment, I was using a system designed by Brainmaster technologists that allows you to use up to 4 separate electromagnetic coils. Each coil is enclosed in a small box and controlled by computer software. I decided to use 2 coils placed on the right radial and temporal regions, following Dr. Powell's suggestion. Based on the research, it seems clear that pulsing the electromagnetic wave at a slow frequency was likely to decrease activation in the area exposed. I decided to set the system to 3 Hz in the delta range frequency, which is often associated with deep sleep. I started to record the EEG, hit go on the TMS program, and waited to see what would happen. And then here's the image. Right there. Julie reported that she was calling upon her spiritual support team and asked any of them to come forward if they had a message for her. She indicated that she saw her deceased grandmother Stella. She reported that her grandmother was Polish, and Julie could smell specific Polish foods that her grandmother used to cook. Julie indicated that her grandmother wanted to get her excited about cabbage season coming soon. I thought cabbage season was year-round. She said that she had never met her grandmother, but knew she was gifted with psychic abilities. When this interaction concluded, there was a pause of about 25 seconds when Julie did not say anything. When she started talking again, she said, "I don't know how to describe what I'm seeing." She attempted to explain what was happening in her inner visions by stating that she was seeing a bunch of crop circle symbols. She understood that these were keys of some kind, recognizing that these symbols were connected to many other systems, including the chakra system and sacral geometry. She indicated that mushrooms were somehow also connected to the symbolic language. She said that it is not just for the forest that understands the language of fungi, that this is more of a universal language. At about 5-minute mark of the session, Julie said, "Wow, you should see what I'm seeing." Julie went on to describe visions of Mayan and Egyptian cultures and the understanding that the same symbols were used in both. She said that each civilization builds the foundation of other civilizations. Even if they occurred in a very different parts of the world, somehow they were connected and advanced in relation to the other. As the session continued, Julie said, what the is pulsing?" At which point she began laughing. Julie went on, continuing to translate the download she was receiving. She stated that she's never seen any kind of information before and indicated that we as the human race are being asked to level up into the 5th dimension way of understanding. Julie stated that believing is the 4th dimension construct, while knowing is associated with the 5th dimension. After the 5th dimension, everything just is. You don't have to say you believe or know something because it simply is. In the last part of the session, Julie stated that psychedelics were given to society to nudge us out of a dense vibrational state. Julie then described seeing the base of the huge tree that had an opening, as if it had been struck by lightning. Julie then described seeing the base of a huge tree that had an opening, as if it had been struck by lightning. Inside this opening was an entire universe. Julie described the scene as very psychedelic. At this point, we wrapped it up. The entire session was under 10 minutes. When the session was over and I asked Julie if the session was any different than her typical sessions, she responded with an emphatic yes. She told me that the amount of information coming through was nearly overwhelming and felt a bit psychedelic. In the session with the TMS, she felt that she was continually being shown in various ways that everything is connected, that we are all one. Julie stated that her typical sessions are much more tame. It is interesting that the theme of the TMS session seemed to be connection to unity. Remember the part of the brain we were deactivating? This is related to boundaries between self and others. In fact, you might recall from Chapter 1 that disrupting activity in this region caused by head injury often results in increased empathy and spirituality. When I glanced at the EEG recording from the session, I was initially disappointed. There were giant waves all over the screen that couldn't possibly be real. My best guess was that the TMS was somehow causing interference with the EEG. I had considered that possibility before beginning this experiment, but remembered seeing published research studies in which they were recording EEG activity during TMS session. If this was done in a published study, you would assume it was a non-issue. I figured it would have thrown out all the EEG data and just see what I could use from the experiment from the other readings Julie did while hooked up. Being tenacious and having a sense that there may be more to the story than TMS interference, I dug into the EEG recording a bit further. When I scrolled to the beginning of the session, these patterns were not present. In fact, they didn't show up until about the 6-minute mark of the session. After the 6-minute mark, it was pretty much continuous until we stopped the session. Julie had not moved her body or done anything else that might cause the change. I was continually monitoring the connection of all the electrodes, which all looked fine. So what was causing this presumed malfunction during the last third of the session? It wasn't caused by Julie doing anything differently, and it didn't appear to be caused by the TMS. If it was, we should have seen the same old pattern throughout the entire recording. The only remaining explanation that made sense was that this represented a shift in Julie's brain. I reduced the number of EEG channels I was observing and increased the scale on the screen. This allowed me to get a bit more clarity about what I was seeing. With this magnification, it became clear that the big changes were all happening in the right hemispheres, and we were particularly focused around the area of the right parietal lobe. This made sense as this is where the coils were placed. The other area involved was the right frontal lobe, which has a lot of connections to the RPL. The image below shows selected EEG sensor data from the earlier sessions of Julie's section of Julie's session. This is a fairly typical looking EEG. The first two lines represent left and right frontal channels. Lines 3 and 4 represent left and right temporal channels, and lines 5 and 6 represent left and right parietal channels. In the top image, there are two large excursions in the first few lines. This is caused by eye blinking and shows the impact of muscle movement on the EEG. And then here's the picture of all that. And that says EEG samples before TMS. The next sample below comes after the 6-minute mark. You can still see a few eye blinks in the frontal channels, but you will also notice that all of the right-sided channels look much different than their left-sided counterparts. This pattern looks like what we see with high-power delta brainwaves. And then it says EEG samples during TMS. Clearly, the TMS was causing a significant dysregulation in the right hemisphere. But why did it take 6 minutes to show up? Apparently, the brain requires a certain level of consistent information in order to shift gears. In this case, 6 minutes seemed to do the trick. Perstinger's God Helmet session would usually last about 30 minutes. A quick review of other stimulation technologies and other recommended programs show that most manufacturers of these devices recommend between 10 and 30 minutes to get the significant shift. The evidence that TMS could be used to help instigate certain paranormal experiences or enhance intuition seemed clear. Persinger's research and my own mini experiments with Julie and a few other willing participants convinced me that I was on the right track, and that the right parietal regions of the brains were the most effective and appropriate targets for this approach. I also wondered if any other brain entertainment technologies could have similar effects. Audio-visual entertainment refers to technologies that involve... Audio-visual entertainment, which is also called AVE, refers to technologies that involve stimulating the brain with light and sound, rather than with pulsed electromagnetic frequencies. A typical AEV device consists of specialized glasses with lights built into the eye set and headphones connected to either a controller box or software on a computer. The user can choose from a wide range of different frequencies that are transmitted to help the person by turning the signal on and off at the desired rate. Like TMS, you can use AVE systems to encourage the brain towards specific states of activity. For example, if you were interested in enhancing theta brainwaves, you could choose 7 Hz pulse rate. The lights would flicker on and off 7 times each second, synchronized with a tone in the headphones. The brain attempts to match this frequency through something called the evoked response, resulting in an increase of stimulated brainwave pattern. In Chapter 3, we discussed using AVE technology for the Ganzfeld effect, which is a static approach, simply leaving the lights on the entire time. I was interested in also using this tech to encourage specific brain waves that appear in the related psi abilities. While working on this book, I began teaching a 4-week online technology-assisted psychic exploration class. As part of each registration, all participants received a pair of AVE glasses. Each week, I would present information related to the brain science behind psi abilities, and then we would experiment with the AVE protocol designed to facilitate the associated brainwave patterns. Participants would then work with that protocol for the next week until I introduced a new approach. Even though I have more than 20 years of teaching experience, I was a little bit nervous beginning this class. While I had tested these protocols in my office, I didn't know if this approach could work with larger populations in a group setting. The whole thing was a grand exploration. Now, after teaching this course multiple times, I can comfortably say that it appears to work, sometimes with quite dramatic results. While discussing their experience with the theta brainwave protocol, one student in the class described connecting with their higher self. My higher self came to me in the form of a geometric shape that was red, but it's not like one I've seen before, like a really weird M. It mostly stayed in the form of red shape, and it was masculine, which was unusual for me. It was basically just telling me that a lot of really great things are coming, and I have to trust in the process that I'm never actually alone. There is a part of me that I am retrieving. Then it laid down into me in a chair, and I felt this sense of something else that is totally me, sitting with me. It was a really pleasant experience. Another student described how a recent session seemed to have activated some kind of deep connection to Earth that has remained with her outside of the AVE session. I couldn't get to sleep the other night, and I did a delta session, and it felt fabulous. My physiology loved this frequency. I stayed there for a while and eventually fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke up experiencing a consciousness deep inside the Earth. It is communicating through what feels like an astral voice. I can feel the inside of Earth's consciousness and all of the ley lines and grids. There's a very vivid imagery, and I felt sense. I experienced it in all of the sensory modalities, what it's like to be the grids, the meridians, the soil, the bacteria of the earth from different periods of existence. I can feel this sense of other extinction periods, and the earth really talked about, do you have any idea what it's like for us to have this much population? Do you have any idea what it's like for us to have this much concrete, to not be able to breathe, our key being depleted? It has been so real and so deep. I am experiencing this during normal life. It has been so profound. It is like this voice that wants to be heard. It is so powerful. I can actually feel rumblings through the earth as if it's saying, this won't be tolerated much longer, and we want you to know. Of course, these examples are not fully representative. In some cases, the experiences are relatively mundane. Another participant in this same class provided this report of their experience. I did a theta protocol before our last class. I always feel stoned afterward. I look affected. It feels really good. I love it. I'm doing that theta protocol and trying to balance it with an alpha protocol afterwards. It's been wonderful. Nothing psychic, but very visual, very bodily. I want more cool stuff, but I'm just getting out of the way. This type of experience is fairly common. It sounds pleasant, but doesn't seem to be leading to any enhanced psi experiences. Based on these and other reports, I have identified 3 themes that are important to consider when using tech for psi exploration. Individual differences. Not surprisingly, not everyone has the same response to these sessions. While some participants report powerful and personal meaningful experiences in their ABE sessions, others state that this was a nice or fine experience. In some cases, students might not or might even dislike a session or find it unpleasant. For this reason, it is important to experiment with a variety of protocols and settings. Sometimes slightly modifying the frequency can significantly change the experience. In other instances, it is necessary to change the color or intensity of the light or other aspects of the program to maximize the benefit. When students spend time learning how to use the system and tracking their experiences, nearly everyone is able to find at least one approach that works for them. In general, it appears that the ABE and TMS techniques have stronger effects on those with background in psi-related activities. In the personal accounts described above, the first 2 participants have a relatively strong background in psi-related practice, while the third person does not. This trend has been regularly seen across groups and suggests that stimulation technology amplifies pre-existing abilities. You may recall that we saw a similar process in Chapter 3 when participants were using the Gansfeld technique with white noise. This observation is consistent with the finding that the technology makes it easier to tap in. If you already know how to extend or expand your consciousness in psi-related ways, the technology seems to give a boost. If you do not know how to tap or tune in, it may be necessary to explore much more traditional psychic development practices alongside the use of technology. Simply zapping your brain may not be enough. The report from the second student above, as well as my own experience, helps demonstrate another theme. In some instances, the impact of the AEB or TMS session isn't experienced until after the session has ended. This is highlighted in another comment from a class participant. I got much more of an effect from the session after the session was over than when I was experiencing the flickering lights directly. In terms of getting back to an old feeling of heightened intuition, I felt it was more useful to run the session and then stay quiet, leaving the lights off using the state that came from after the lights were off. This person happened to have a background in neurobiology and offered a possible explanation for this experience. My model is that when the brain is doing any kind of complex activity, lots of different brain areas are being activated in very complex ways. It seems to me that when you're putting yourself in front of a flashing light that is driving the brain, there's a possibility that the AVE is not letting the brain go to those complex states, but rather biasing sensitive centers in the brain towards a certain frequency, making the brain sensors more able to do what they might be likely to do. But if it is running consistently, it is not giving another process a chance to knit that activity together. While it seems clear that the brain stimulation technologies can have a significant impact on psi-related experience and intuition, the mechanism of action is poorly understood. Suffice it to say, the brain is highly complex, and there are myriad individual differences that may influence how each person responds to specific stimulation device and frequencies. The only way to know for sure how a particular technique will impact your abilities is through self-experimentation. Since this chapter deals specifically with using brain stimulation techniques, all of the try-it-yourself approaches involve some kind of technology. The good news is that there are some effective, easy-to-use, and relatively cost-efficient options available. Below, I outline 2 of the consumer-grade devices available that we recommend and use in our classes. NeoRhythm. The NeoRhythm is a low-power TMS device, and what I use in my self-experiments described above. It is designed in a form of a headband that communicates up to a phone app through Bluetooth. You can find out more about this device by checking our website. I can't actually put that in my description. When working with the NeoRhythm or similar device, there are a few considerations that may be helpful. Power. Anything that uses electricity also has a magnetic field. The strength of those magnetic fields are measured in microteslas, abbreviated UT. When exposure to prolonged or high-powered magnetic fields can be harmful. There is no evidence that exposure to low-powered magnetic fields is problematic. If anything, research suggests that low-powered magnetic fields, when used strategically, can enhance healing. The amount of power used in the NeoRhythm is relatively small. For perspective, the field strength of most appliances in your home ranges from 0.02 to 7 UT. Even though we are dealing with relatively low-power devices, they can still influence the brain and states of consciousness. In addition, different individuals seem to have varied levels of sensitivity to this form of neurostimulation. Bless you. For this reason, I generally recommend starting with a power setting around 0.5 or 1.0 UT in assessing the effect. If you feel dizzy, lightheaded, or any other way uncomfortable, try shifting a low power. If you don't notice anything, try turning it up a bit. If you want to disrupt functioning in the right parietal lobe, you will want the coils to be on the right parietal and temporal lobes. So the rest of this chapter is just explaining different kinds of neurotechnology that you can use to, I guess, tap in to what we've been talking about in this chapter. And I don't really feel comfortable explaining that or reading this part to the world. So like I said, if you want to read this book and read the rest of this chapter 6, you are more than welcome to do that. And I will be reading this on my own time. So thanks again.